Hello and welcome. The unthinkable had happened. In January 1942, Japanese General Yamashita's army was advancing southwards through Malaya towards Singapore. Singapore's defence depended on an assault from the sea. It was Winston Churchill who said, "The possibility of Singapore having no landward defences no more entered my mind than that of a battleship being launched without a bottom." Japanese Mitsubishi bombers rained havoc, untroubled by a feeble air defence over Singapore. European women and their children were advised to leave, and many got away by sea. This included my wife's mother, who had the surname Clay. Some boats loaded passengers alphabetically, including my future mother-in-law's ship, Devonshire. The A's through to the C's made it onto the boat before it had to sail to avoid being bombed. Men were ordered to stay behind to defend the city. Ian Morrison's book, Malayan Postscript, written in May 1942, explains how British and Commonwealth forces succumbed to a force of Japanese who were one-third their number. For the Metherell family, evacuation of the mother and her two young sons, ages 2 and 4, was to be by S-23 Empire flying boat on the 14th of January 1942. All 24 seats on that plane were taken, flying low, just 1,000 feet, and at night in monsoonal weather they were able to avoid Japanese patrols. Just 2 weeks later, another S-23 flying boat, VH-ABW, was shot down off the coast of Timor whilst making the same trip. The night flight south to Surabaya, then on to Darwin, was arduous, but nothing compared to the hardships that were to come. That 4-year-old boy, Alan, later wrote, "Escape from the Rising Sun," an account of his family's flight to safety. The family rested overnight in Darwin, then departed from Fanny Bay Aerodrome in an MMA Lockheed 10A Electra VH Alpha Bravo Victor at 1:45 p.m. on Friday the 16th of January. This 10-seater, twin-engine aircraft was named RMA Gascoigne. Apart from Mrs. Metherell and her 2 boys, there were 2 other women on board and 2 pilots, Captain Jim Branch and First Officer Captain Reg Bagwell. Reg had trained at the Royal Aero Club in 1935 in West Australia, and of the 2 was more familiar with the route. The plan was to cruise at 8,000 feet and stop at Wyndham, Derby and then Broome, eventually arriving in Perth late the following day. Arrival into Wyndham was a welcome 15-minute break with tea and sandwiches for the passengers and fuel for the aircraft before they departed at 2:40 p.m. An hour and a half later, at 4:10 p.m, the right engine failed catastrophically as one of the 9 crankshift link rods snapped. The propeller could not be feathered and the drag caused the Electra to lose height. Bagwell knew that Munja, a native mission, was closer, but Branch disagreed, opting to continue on their route to Derby, perhaps make the flatland near Meader Station. Meader was 24 miles east of Derby. Bagwell sent urgent Morse code radio messages that were picked up in Wyndham, Broome and Halls Creek. Below, low scrub, rocks and giant anthills offered no sanctuary until they saw a swampy clearing allowing a wheels-up landing at 70 miles per hour. Within seconds they had come to a halt due to the tall grass and swampy mud. Now what? Bagwell helped Mrs. Wilgris, Miss McLean, Mrs. Metherell and the 2 boys to step from the rear door and into the mud. For the plane itself, bent propellers, bent flaps and bent lower engine cowlings seemed to be the only damage. The engine cowlings had scooped up the soft mud, no doubt helping them to come to a safe stop. It was 4:45 p.m. and sunset just 2 hours away when Reg Bagwell's Morse code to Broome and Wyndham was read. Rescue was possible. When would help come? Broome Radio telephoned Bob Rowell at Derby Airport, who was waiting for the overdue Electra, and Bob deduced that the aircraft had come down about 15 miles from Napier Downs Station. It was actually 31 miles. Bob dictated a telegram to MMA Managing Director Horry Miller's home in Perth. He in turn phoned Chief Engineer Frank Colquhoun at Maylands Hangar. It was decided that pilots Alec Witham and Clive Chambers would fly their other Electra, Alpha Bravo Whiskey, named RMA Kimberley, to Derby next morning with engineers Frank Colquhoun and Roy Guest. The sun set on the swamp and the mosquitoes came in force to torment the survivors. Extra clothing worn to protect the children was discarded as it was just too stifling hot. There was no food to eat that night. Saturday morning and the mosquitoes called it a night, to be replaced by stinging March flies. The thought of covering themselves with the abundant mud to thwart the stinging insects didn't enter their heads. Some biscuits were found and plenty of drinking water was available to wash them down. The only available aircraft in Darwin, a Fox Moth, took off at 1:45 p.m. but returned due to engine problems. Sister ship, Electra ABW, landed at Broome at 5 p.m. after a day-long flight from Perth. Alec Witham elected to continue on to Derby, where he landed at 6 p.m. He was very tired. He had intended to commence the search on Sunday morning, but when he was shown the radio messages from Reg Bagwell detailing their plight, he had Derby agent Bob Rowell load supplies into the plane. Not long after it took off flying the track ABV would have taken when the crew saw the smoke, turned and flew over the downed Electra at 100 feet. They pushed out 2 sacks from the plane containing food, cooking utensils, mosquito nets and more. It was 6:35 p.m. and the survivors had their first meal in 30 hours, which never tasted so good. Early Sunday morning and Reg and Jim wandered further out and found beyond the swamp an area of firm soil. They could clear it to make a landing area, if only they had an axe. Alpha Bravo Whiskey, the Kimberley, took off towards Old Napier Downs Station and dropped a message to owner Ted DeLauer in an MMA mailbag that an aircraft with passengers had force landed on their property. Later, at 5 p.m, it dropped 7 bags of supplies to the downed Electra, and that included an axe. A note said that Gordon Smith and a party from Meter Station were leaving Monday morning for them. Monday morning, and the 2-year-old boy was sick. Dengue fever racked his body. Tuesday morning in Perth, Horry Miller sought out veteran pilot Jamie Woods. With 12,000 hours experience, he was one of the most able pilots in the Southern Hemisphere. Both knew that if they couldn't land a plane near Gascoyne, then they couldn't salvage her. The only plane available was the 4-seater Cessna C-37 VH Uniform Zulu uniform. This just happened to be the first new Cessna imported into Australia and recently has been restored to mint flying condition. It was noon when the Napier party reached the survivors and spirits lifted at the thought of leaving that swamp. Wednesday at 9 a.m, the Meter group arrived. Whilst the Napier and Meter groups proposed using the horses to ride out the passengers, Frank Colquhoun proposed to clear 350 metres to fly out them in the Cessna. In the afternoon, the Kimberley arrived to parachute a recharger for the Gascoyne's batteries. Radio communication could be restored. Later that day, the Cessna appeared overhead and Captain Woods scanned the area for obstacles. The following day, Thursday, the runway was complete and Gascoigne's battery was recharged. Talk turned to recovering Gascoigne, but how? Logs would be needed, many logs. Friday, one whole week after the forced landing, the now working radio let Jamie Woods at Derby know that the runway was 270 yards by 65 feet and was cleared. Would it be big enough for him? Jamie paced out 275 yards at Derby Airport and began trying out techniques to both take off and land in such a short distance. When he was sure he could do it, he flew to the crash site and landed on the prepared strip. It was decided that Miss McLean would be the first to be flown out. If the Cessna didn't make it, she, being single, would leave fewer people to mourn. Happily, they made it. The Cessna returned with a jack needed to lift the Electra. It was Mrs. Wilris's turn to be flown out. Everyone was happy to see her go, a most unpleasant woman to be marooned with. The Cessna returned and Mrs. Metherell and the two children were flown out. It wasn't until the Kimberley had flown the Metherells from Derby to Broome that 2-year-old Alex, close to death from dengue fever, was seen by a doctor slowly recovering with treatment. The family made their way to Perth on the SS Centre. She wasn't going to fly. The father escaped from Singapore on an oil tanker as the Japanese landed there and arrived into Fremantle to join his family, not knowing of their fate. I work to continue to recover the downed Electra. In 1942, with the World at War, the 2 Australian Electras were irreplaceable. Writing off the downed Electra and taking the insurance payout wasn't an option. Jamie Woods kept the working men fed, landing the Cessna beside the banks of Limestone Creek 21 times. 2 propellers and sections of a Pratt & Whitney engine were ferried in. Recovering the Electra started with building timber supports under her so that it could be raised with the jack. The wheels could be then lowered. Raising could only be done incrementally, raising each side in turn and placing more wood under each wing. The threat of the Electra toppling was real, especially if the wind got up. Another engineer, Charlie Rolandi, came to assist. By now, the news got to them that the Japanese were now in Timor, within striking distance of Australia. Newspapers were dropped to them by the Kimberley on its Darwin run. The work was slow and dirty. At day's end, the Limestone Creek water washed them clean. Captain Branch flew out with Woods on the 27th of January, leaving Reg as he was needed to operate the radio. On Saturday, the 31st, Ned DeLau returned with 30 semi-wild donkeys needed to haul the Electra to the runway. A log bridge had been built over the creek. 17 days after the crash and 12 since the salvage had begun, on the evening on the 2nd of February 1942, Gascoigne had been hauled out of the swamp over the creek and onto firm ground. Storms and flooding rain prevented further work until day 22 of the salvage, when both repaired engines were fired up and tested. Day 27 of the salvage, excess fuel was drained to light the Electra. A wind had sprung up and it was blowing straight down the runway. Reg Bagwell took off in the Cessna and circled to witness what was to come. Jamie Woods fired up the Electra and finessed the Electra into the sky. The ordeal was over. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and hit the notify bell to encourage more content.